But I do think that this whole business of individual rights versus collective rights is an interesting one. So I am putting out a challenge to my fellow Canadian YouTubers, particularly those on the left. Is this a good system of rights we have in this country?
There is an interesting asymmetry between the way Canada is perceived from the outside and how Canadians tend to feel about their own political processes, institutions, and traditions. From the outside looking in, Canada is often perceived as much more progressive than it really is, in part because they're maybe contrasting hysteria about the United States of America to propaganda about how wonderful life is in Canada. So Canada seems very progressive and forward-thinking compared to the United States of America, but in part also because we have a constitution written in the year 1982. Technically, it's called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, not the Constitution. Technically, it's an annex to the British North America Act. Let's not get into details. In effect, the Constitution of Canada was only written in 1982. So for many people from the outside looking in, they think, wow, it must be wonderful to live in a country where you're not encumbered by centuries of tradition or by having a constitution written in the sort of befuddled, opaque language of centuries past, full of uncomfortable compromises about slavery, colonialism, or imperialism. That must be wonderful. And Canadians never see it that way and never feel that way. We tend to feel that we're trapped in a tremendously conservative, anti-revolutionary regime that was defined in the first place by a refusal to participate in, a refusal to countenance or legitimate the American steps taken towards democracy. We were the people, the so-called United Empire Loyalists, who decided to remain loyal to king and country to follow the British colonial path. So let's just start with an inspirational quotation from that 1982 Canadian Constitution so you can get a feeling of just how hip and postmodern and post-colonial and forward-looking our Constitution really is. Canada advocates the abolition of imperialism, colonialism, and any other form of aggression, dominion, or exploitation in the relations between peoples, as well as simultaneous and controlled general disarmament, the dissolution of political and military blocs, the establishment of a collective security system, with a view to the creation of an international order that is capable of ensuring peace and justice in the relations between peoples. Canada recognizes people's rights to self-determination, independence, and to development, as well as the right of insurrection against all forms of oppression. Isn't that wonderful? Rejecting imperialism, rejecting colonialism. Doesn't this sound like the kind of forward-looking, positive, optimistic 20th century constitution you'd expect a country like Canada to have? I just quoted for you the Constitution of Portugal, written in 1974. I had a very interesting confrontation with a professor at the University of Victoria not too many years ago. Came into the classroom, and he was giving this very fiery, dramatic performance, telling the students what a revolutionary, forward-looking document the Constitution of Canada is, this same document from the 1980s, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, telling these students, I think every single student in the classroom, except for myself, was a First Nations person, an Indigenous Canadian, a Native Canadian. I think I was the only white person there. Maybe there was one other white person, I forget, but very few students in the class. He was telling them that our Constitution holds up the rights of Indigenous peoples, overturns centuries of colonialism and oppression, and that it reaches out to this tremendous history we have of signing treaties, making a commitment with the Indigenous people. And I'll always remember his words. He said it takes those treaties and it proudly declares that from now on, those are the law of the land. And when it was question period, I put my hand up, and the first thing I said to him was, you know, I've read the Constitution of Portugal. The Constitution of Portugal is a constitution written by a revolutionary country that explicitly says they reject their history of colonialism, they reject their history of imperialism, they reject their history of slavery against indigenous peoples of South America, places like Brazil, you can imagine, enslavement of peoples in Africa. It actually says those things in the text. There are countries around the world that have constitutions that make these kinds of declarations, you're saying. Canada is not one of them. And I challenged him on 2 points. Pardon me. Is there a single sentence in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that has a single word along the lines of what you've just paraphrased or quoted from it? Is there a single sentence there about the importance of Indigenous peoples or regretting the history of colonialism or any of the rest of that? Or are you actually basing all this claim about the one kind of suffix, the one appendix, the one little thing tacked onto the end where it says, notwithstanding the details here stated out, this won't abrogate our treaty obligations to the Native people? There's this little footnote to a footnote, little shameful secret shoved in under the rug that, oh yeah, right, the country is built on colonialism and genocide. It's deeply dishonest, in no way inspiring, in no way revolutionary document, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Constitution of Canada. It utterly fails to do the things a constitution ought to do. And I also pointed out to the professor that, contrary to what he'd said, this is not a secular document describing the government of Canada as a sort of atheist and progressive one, that the very first sentence, perhaps he was overlooking it, declares that Canada is, it actually declares that Canada is a theocracy, basically, if it were taken seriously. It opens with a religious pronouncement or religious declaration. This can't be read as a document defining a secular state. If you think about what it is that a constitution is supposed to do, or what it is that a Charter of Rights and Freedoms is supposed to do, that is precisely what Canada's Constitution and Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms refuses to do. Because what it tells you is that you have all the rights and freedoms that would be reasonable in a democratic society, and those freedoms are only limited in a way that would be justifiable or reasonable in a democratic society. You have to define in this same document what is reasonable, what is justice, what is democracy, what is a democrat. This document is supposed to be telling you precisely what it refuses to tell you. And in practice, what does this mean? What would the Canadian public in general, if that's the point, if you're just supposed to take a poll and ask people what they think is reasonable, like as if this document right now isn't supposed to tell them, if you do it the other way around, obviously all you're going to be able to hear from the Canadian public is some kind of ill-informed imitation of American society, because the American idea of democracy is what they're familiar with from television and movies. Our Constitution in 1982 was an opportunity to slam the door on a racist past, on a colonialist past, on a British imperial past. And the government of Canada utterly failed to slam the door. They produced a document that absolutely nobody is proud of. And I have to tell you, I'm born and raised in Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen. I'm living in a country that I myself am in no way proud of. I feel tremendously ashamed of my country. And this Constitution, written during my own lifetime, is a big part of that. Political conflicts, at their worst, tend to resemble religious conflicts. And the discussion of politics never seems more religious than when we're talking about written constitutions. That's not because people believe in constitutions in the same sense that they believe in a religion. However, people have the same sense of hopelessness about constitutions, that whatever the Constitution may say, good or bad, it's something they can never hope to change themselves. It's something they can never overcome themselves. These documents that often, in the time that they were written, supposedly stated the lofty, optimistic aspirations for a better world of their authors, instead become a kind of ceiling limit, a kind of encumbrance that everyone has to work around because, well, no matter how bad it may be, that's the Constitution and we're stuck with it. That illusion is pervasive here in Canada, even though our Constitution was only written in 1982 and nobody in Canada regards any of the authors of that Constitution with any special respect. They don't have the aura of heroic revolutionaries like, say, Mao Zedong has in China. They don't have the aura of great intellectuals that many of the contributors to the American Constitution still have in American politics. They're thought of as brilliant men and creative writers who wrote interesting books and who lived remarkable lives. Absolutely no illusion of this kind exists in Canada. And yet still, the Constitution inspires this sense of almost religious dread and hopelessness. When you talk to Muslims who are trying to be good people and live in the modern world and lead a rational life, but who are also trying to maintain their status as pious Muslims to some extent, they have this same feeling about what's written in the Quran and what's written in the Hadith. Like, well, whatever it says there, we're stuck with it. So you can rationalize it, you can make excuses, you can work around with it, but there's no way to change it. Even worse, the examination of constitutions has this strange sort of blindness on the part of the reader that religious texts also seem to inspire. I have experience as a scholar of Buddhism, and I have a whole long life of very peculiar political activism. It's amazing that you can be sitting next to someone who's a pious Buddhist and show them what the text says and point with your finger word by word. And they still don't see it, and they won't admit to themselves what the text so plainly says. Or if you ask them, what do you think this means? They won't let themselves think it through clearly. I'm sure some of you have this experience in Christianity or Islam, whatever the religion may be, when you really just try to get someone to talk, okay, word by word, think about what this short paragraph says, think about these few sentences. They will see things that are not there in the text, and they will also refuse to see things that are there. And I've had that experience again and again, even with professors at the University of Toronto, even with professors at the University of Victoria, who are themselves supposedly activists representing our native people, or they're left-wing activists trying to make the world a better place under one heading or another. There's a fundamental refusal to see this text for what it is. And I think these two impulses are linked. Because if you can really admit to yourself how mediocre or even awful this text is, then that immediately leads to the impulse to change it, reform it, improve it, or do better. And then that leads to that sense of hopelessness, that sense of religious dread. Nobody even knows who wrote the Bible. The anonymous authors of the Bible, who were imperfect in so many ways. The Bible's full of errors and repetition and self-contradiction. But whatever it is, if you believe in it, we're stuck with it and it can't be changed. This same sense of dread manages to haunt Canada in relation to a document written in 1982 that nobody believes in. That nobody even feels the sense of foolish pride the Americans have, that they have the best country in the world with the best constitution in the world. And the question is, why? How did we come to be a nation so utterly resigned to its own mediocrity?
Yeah, the planet is dying. The government hates us. The animals are leaving. The aliens aren't contacting us. We might be alone. It just might be you and me. But that's okay, because do you really need anyone else?